Today we have Joe Morbitzer here as our presenter. Joe began his career in law enforcement with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office in the early 80s. In 1986, he accepted a position with the Westerville Division of Police and eventually became the Chief of Police in 2005. Chief Morbitzer had been recognized for his efforts supporting the Special Olympics for Ohio, receiving the Ohio Special Olympics Award of Merit. He also received the Ohio Association of Chiefs of Police Michael J. Kelly Award for Excellence and Innovation in Policing. Under his direction, the Westerville Division of Police has been awarded the Ohio Attorney General's Meritorious Achievement Award on 5 occasions for crime solving and crime prevention initiatives. A few years ago, he had the awful experience of losing 2 of his officers. Remember those that event up in Westerville? He was chief at that time. They were killed in the line of duty, very tragic. So he subsequently retired recently, and then under our new governor was appointed the superintendent of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and Identification. Has anyone ever been to BCII before or know much about BCII here in Ohio? You're in for a great treat. This is a fascinating organization. Joe serves on various boards and committees, extremely important to him. He's a member of the Ohio Attorney General's State Victims Advisory Board, the Ohio Attorney General's Task Force on Community Relations and Police Training, the Law Enforcement Somali Advisory Board, the Homeland Security Law Enforcement Terrorism Prevention Advisory Board, the Franklin University Criminal Justice Advisory Board. So he's obviously very busy. And wait till you hear more about BCII today. Let's welcome Joe Morbitzer to Columbus Rotary.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I start, I'm going to shamelessly invite everyone to Westerville Sunrise Rotary's Field of Heroes and during Memorial Day weekend next year. I've been a member of Rotary now for 12 years with Sunrise. So I thank you for all that you do, and I know how important it is for us to stay doing what we do with our community volunteerism, so I thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to come and explain what BCI is, and on behalf of the Attorney General, Dave Yost, thank you for this opportunity also. When I first had the opportunity to look at this position, I thought I knew what BCI was about. You know, I was a cop for a long time, and I thought I knew what they were about. So before I started there, I talked to some of the investigators. I said, so what keeps you guys busy? And they said, homicides. Homicides, we've been real busy this past year. And when they say real busy, I'm thinking 40, maybe 50 throughout the state. Understand, we investigate throughout the state, so there are about 960 police departments in the state and 88 sheriff's departments, and we represent quite a few of those organizations. So when I asked them, I said, so how busy is busy? And they said, I think we investigated about 300 homicides last year. Well, 412 in 1 year they investigated. That's just one crime, and that's crime scene and the investigators going out. So when you look at it, that unit of BCI is extremely busy in and of itself. We have a number of bureaus in BCI, some that I didn't even know existed until I got there. And when I started telling people I was going to take the job at BCI, it shocked me that most of the public had no idea what BCI is. When you say, what is BCI, they think it's an industrial cleaning company or something like that. So one of our main goals is to really get BCI's mission out, and that's one of the reasons we are presenting like we are here today. But the purpose of BCI is to support police departments all over the state. We cannot initiate investigations. We have to be requested by statute. So we just can't go into an area and start an investigation. We have to be invited in by the jurisdiction that the crime happened in. We then take on that jurisdiction's authority. So if it's a county, we have countywide authority. If it's a state agency, we have statewide authority at that point. If it's a local, we operate with them and try to help them out as much as we possibly can. When we looked at BCI and I looked at it, there were units I never thought existed. The Environmental Crimes Unit, which is really working very closely with the EPA on a lot of pollution-related violations that affect all of us. They affect the water table. They affect a lot of things. The Environmental Crimes Unit is tremendous at what they do. Our drone, they actually think they're a squadron. But we do have 8 drones and 6 pilots that we use for investigations. We use that for marijuana eradication. There are a number of things we use the drones for. School safety plans. One of the things that we do are help jurisdictions with school safety plans. So we'll use the drones to look at the property. Those are then put into a database that the schools or police agencies can access in time of an emergency. So when you get very advanced plans, the police department can jump right into some of the schools' cameras and get their IP address for security purposes. So we've helped them with that. One of the things that surprised me but also disappointed me was our public corruption unit. And I did not realize across the state how many cases of public corruption there are in a given year. We're looking at, on a high here, we're doing 90 cases. On an average year, we're doing 70. And those are for felony public corruption cases. Those aren't minor things that we're talking about. So that was kind of disappointing for me. You know, dedicating my life to public service, I did not expect that. So one of the things we are trying to help people with our constitutional law section, especially some of these smaller towns and villages, is how not to get in trouble, because they just don't know, and they cause major violations. So we do a lot of education through our Constitutional Law Bureau. We have a dive team. They've been very successful. They solved 2 homicides in this last month by recovering suspect weapons. So they are asked, and they go all over the state also. That's the investigation side. And then we have crime scene. And those are the folks that go out and process every crime scene. You've seen CSI, so you know what that, and it is that. I was sharing with Mike, we just had a couple cases that were pretty amazing. We had a triple homicide in Ross County, and within 12 hours with DNA, they had identified both suspects and had arrested both suspects out of a triple homicide within 12 hours. We had a case we worked with the Marion County Sheriff's Office. They had a 10-year-old homicide that was unsolved, and the victim was unidentified, an unidentified female. They did isotope testing on her ribs and teeth, and when they came back, they told me she was born and raised in Louisiana or Alabama. And I thought, there's no way, you know, give me a break. And sure enough, she was born and raised in Louisiana. So then we started looking at missings out of Louisiana, did some DNA swabs with relatives down there, found her daughter that was an exact match, and we were able to at least give the family closure after 10 years of not knowing what had happened. We've also just recently solved 2 serial murder cases through familial DNA. So when we talk about familial, it's somebody close in your bloodline gets arrested and they do a DNA swab, excuse me, and it comes back with a hit out of the CODIS database. The CODIS database are DNA samples on a federal level. Thank you. And we were able in one case to identify a suspect who was in a halfway house in Arizona through the rape his brother had committed. And we were able to go out there, do a DNA swab, and tied him to 5 homicides, which we're working with the FBI right now because he's an over-the-road trucker. So he had access to people all over the country, and three of the homicides happened outside of the state of Ohio. The other case was an individual who killed 7 people, and we were able to identify him through a DNA sample. So the lab is growing tremendously, especially when we talk about things like the DNA companies where you'll submit your test. With a subpoena now, we can access those databases. It used to be we had open access to those. The courts have ruled now we need a subpoena on that. But when we do that, we can come up with hits on people Sometimes when we look at ancestral DNA, like 3 or 4 generations back or side to side. So when the lab is extremely important, it's helping us solve a ton of cases right now. Our turnaround right now for a DNA sample is about 26 or 27 days. The national average is 150 days. Our biggest competitors, the Georgia Bureau of Criminal Investigation in Tennessee, they're at 90 days. So we are very proud to have, as a matter of fact, here in about 2 weeks, our folks are going to do a national presentation on how we got that turnaround so far down. Our chem lab, which is part of the lab, all the drug testing is up at about 29 days. It was at 24, but everybody familiar with the vape cartridges that are the rage right now? Yeah, you wouldn't believe how many of those have drugs in the vape cartridge. And that's how they're selling them. Understand, when we get a seizure of 10,000 vape cartridges, if it's a different flavor, a different lot number, or a different manufacturer, you have to test 1 out of every one of those batches, which has caused our chem lab turnaround to go up about 3 days. So those 2 areas of our lab, they also have all trace evidence, so they do fingerprinting. Mike was talking about one of the things he didn't realize, we check for all fraud and forgery on lottery tickets. And we actually have a unit that tries to go in and break into the codes of lottery so we can determine the shortcomings of the system prior to it happening. So the lab is extremely busy. And then we've got our identifications area. Anybody been printed for adoption, for travel? Anybody had to submit a fingerprint? You're one of 3.5 million a year submitted to BCI. So they do identification for over 3 million people per year in our ident section. We're working on a new project. It's about a $24 million project to upgrade that system. It hasn't been upgraded in a while, but it's the Ohio Biometrics Identification System. That's fingerprinting, criminal histories, facial recognition, and all other biometrics that will come along the way. We'll be able to expand out on that. That'll be done in about 12 to 14 months. And then another project we're working on from that area is the Ohio Law Enforcement Gateway. And that gives local law enforcement agencies that don't have the means or the money a reporting system to where they can do field reports on the computer. The beauty of that is those agencies are then real-time tied in to each other. So if I have an individual I've dealt with and somebody in Cleveland has them 2 hours later, they will know I had contact with them 2 hours previously. Up until now, there's not been a system to do that, to connect all the records management systems and databases for police departments across the state. And we're working very hard to get as many connected as we possibly can for officer safety. Because if somebody's had a problem with an individual, I would like the frontline officer to know that prior to making a stop or a contact. So we're working very hard on the OLEG process. That's about a $6 million project. So between those 2 projects, we've got about $30 million invested in technology in the Attorney General's office and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. We are happy to give tours, and if the club would like to break up into groups and come out for a tour of London, we would really, really like to show you around. I know Mike has been there with some folks, and I think you'll be amazed at some of the stuff that goes on at BCI. We not only have labs at London, we have our lab at Richfield, we have a lab at Bowling Green, and we have a lab in Springfield. We have agent locations at 9 spots across the state. So we're working all throughout the state on different things to solve crimes and help people investigate crimes. The Bowling Green lab is working with Battelle right now and Bowling Green University on a process to drill down even farther on DNA. And this is like leading the way in the country right now. So there are a lot of people coming to us asking about the DNA process and what we're doing with Battelle and Bowling Green, and how do we get there, and where are we going as next steps. So we're kind of the benchmark that people look to in the country right now as far as DNA and DNA testing. We are very fortunate to have Bowling Green because they also have a forensics degree up there. So that becomes a recruiting hotspot for us. And we pull those young kids right out of college and put them right to work in the DNA lab. And they are like crazy good. I mean, they're talking about stuff I never could have. It was stuff on TV, you know. I will tell you, we do not solve crimes in 48 minutes like they do on TV, but we're pretty daggone close. So it's just amazing what they do. And again, as a cop, I had no idea until I looked. The assistance they gave us on February the 10th was tremendous. And the crime scene, how they processed it. But not only that, the Victims Advocate Unit that came out and really ministered to our staff, but also the families and then the citizens, is tremendous. We've got our Victims Advocate and Assistance Units that's been in Dayton, and they still are there. They've been there since it happened. And they will assist until they're needed. Our crime scene unit, they've been assisting with some of the stuff over there and helping Dayton out and working hand in hand with the FBI on identification and crime scene setup and stuff like that. So we work very close with a lot of agencies, federal, state, county, and municipals in order to help them. Two of the things that have happened recently that we've had to put a lot of attention to, and sadly we had not before, the heroin epidemic and the opiate epidemic, and really start looking at how do we help different departments process all of those drugs, because right now, any drug you get is laced with something else. Rarely do we get a pure form of any kind of drug in. Most are laced with fentanyls, whether it's fentanyl, carfentanil, or some of the polyfentanyls that they're just coming out with. And you've got to understand, from China and up through Mexico and from China directly, the fentanyls change that quick. Just by changing one small compound structure, they've increased the strength of that. So in Central Ohio, we were a 5-6 cut city at one point, which meant heroin went to 6 different cities, and it's cut 50% at each place. So when the heroin got here, it was 8 to 13, 15% pure, meaning it had a bunch of garbage in it. Well, when we really put an end to the pill mills, we created a vacuum for the opiates. And the cartels, to show you how sophisticated they are, they saw that and flooded our market with really cheap heroin at $12 a bundle, $7 a bundle, depending on where you're at. You could buy heroin less than a 6-pack of beer. And they flooded the market, and then they started introducing the fentanyls. Well, fentanyl is about potentially 100 times more potent than heroin. Add that to the fact that we then became a 1-2 cut city, which means we were getting drugs directly here, and the drugs were coming in then 88 to 92% pure. You had instant overdoses. Introduce fentanyl and carfentanil, and it's an instant death, and there's not much you could do. When the opiate crisis started, we would give people 1 shot of Narcan and usually revive them. The most we've given when I was at Wester was 11 doses to one person before we could bring them back. So to show you the power of that, that's how powerful the drug is. The other thing we've really had to focus on are rape kits. In Ohio, we had a lot of police departments that did not turn in their rape kits to be investigated by our lab. Cleveland had almost 10,000 kits that they had sitting in evidence. We have since gone back and tested every one of those kits. We are now working on a task force up there to identify, because we've identified the suspects now. Now we've got to work with the prosecutor's office and go out and arrest the individuals who committed the rape. Unfortunately, up in Cleveland, some of the kits were so old, we go to the victim and we let them know we have good news and bad news. The good news is we've identified who did this to you. The bad news is the statute of limitations has run out on the rape. And you don't realize the toll that takes on the task force officers who have to break that news also. So one of the things Attorney General Yost is working on is the elimination of statute of limitation on rape. So we can get some justice for the rape victim. When we had Summit County turn in their kits, they turned in about 4,400, or 1,400, I'm sorry. There were 863 positive identifications out of 1,400. So that shows you, and those folks are still out walking around. So we try to get them put in the hotel, the Franklin County and Summit County Hotel, as quick as we can get them in the hotel. But it's very important, and I've got to acknowledge and thank Governor DeWine now, because they're the ones, his administration, that started the Rape Kit Initiative. And it's really bringing justice to the victims of rape. We have continued that on. We've started 2 new units at BCI, one being the cold case unit that deals with all those homicides we talked about with the DNA processing, but they also deal with the old rapes and going out, assisting departments that don't have the means or ability to prosecute these people, working with our special prosecutions unit downtown to get these people prosecuted. And then Governor DeWine also started the opiate initiative, and that was very important for us to address that because it was completely out of control, as you all know. So we are carrying that on. We've got, as I said, the cold case unit that's now dedicated to that, and now we have a special victims unit that looks at missings, crimes against children, and human trafficking, and then elderly abuse. And up until now, we did not have a unit that looked at those things as on a whole, but they are dedicated to looking at those 3 areas and addressing human trafficking. The one thing you have to remember, everything we've talked about is interconnected. So when we look at human trafficking and prostitution, it's related to mental health issues, which are related to drug dependency, which are related to human trafficking and prostitution. So you cannot address these things individually and expect to get a result. It's a multidisciplinary approach, and it has to be, to get these folks into treatment and get them moving in the right direction. The average addict, and when I say addict, understand we're talking about not bad people necessarily, we're talking about people with addictions. The average addict will fall off the wagon 11 to 12 times before they really go straight. So when you hear these people talk about, we'll give them 1 shot and they expect that to work, that's not realistic. And we really need to focus more on long-term health and care for folks when they're addicted, and how do we correct that behavior and get them moving in the right direction. You know, I had a nephew that is a result of heroin addiction. And when people say, you know, why don't you just let them take the heroin and it'll fix itself? Well, you can say that until it's one of your family members. And then I think your whole focus will change when you say that, when you see that. So we have definitely got to get working with other departments on how we correct this problem. Ohio's moving in the right direction, and we're becoming one of the national role models for that as far as treatment and prevention of drug abuse. So with that being said, generally with BCI, people have a lot of questions because they have no idea what it is. So I'll open the floor to any questions you may have. Yes?
When you need to get a subpoena for a fingerprint, or excuse me, for DNA from Ancestry.com or something, are you able to access then the entire database with that subpoena, or are you somehow restricted to specifications based on what you do know or some other limitation?
That's a good question. The law has just changed on that. That used to be an open database where we could just tap right into it. Now we need a court order to put into it. Also, they've changed the requirements for people who submit. Now you have to opt out, or opt in. So, you know, you used to, once you put your stuff in there, you were open. And now you have to opt in to make it public. So it's changed a little bit, made it a little harder for us. Just a few more steps in order to get court orders, but that gives us access to their database. And understand, when we throw our stuff in, it's just looking for a connection and a match. And it may be a familial match, so it may not be a direct match. At that point, it comes to the cold case unit. They start looking at family trees through ancestral DNA and start to track back these individuals. And it may be, like I say, 2 or 3 generations deep. And it may be a branch off into part of the family we didn't even realize until we started doing the ancestral investigation. Yes, sir.
You also involved with fiscal and cybercrime?
The question was fiscal and cybercrime, and those are two units I forgot to mention. We have a forensic accounting unit, and they are super busy. And they travel all over the state and basically look at things like all the white collar piece. The cybercrimes unit is, again, always busy. Our problem with our cybercrimes unit is the people that we get in there get just enough experience to have the private sector hire them at 2 to 3 times what they're making at BCI. So it's a constant turnover, and one of the things we used to look at law enforcement in general was the 25-year employee. Well, there are positions we now have had to look at as a 3 to 5 year position before we change it. Cyber investigations and forensics are one of those. Yes, sir.
So how many people report to you, and what's your annual budget?
Well, that's another good question. And the question was, how many people report to us and what's the annual budget? When BCI was at its high point, we were running about 500 employees. Right now, we're at about 386, trying to build that back up a little bit. The budget just got a kick of $19 million. Understanding a lot of the Attorney General's office didn't have a dedicated budget before. We lived off of lawsuits, and that became part of the budget. Well, that's not a very good way to plan and to budget, is to hope we get a lawsuit in. So Attorney General Yost has really looked at how do we get a stabilized budget and how do we project that out into the future so we know what we have. Yes, sir.
Yeah, does the, you mentioned consolidating the databases. Does the online first responder get real-time information about concealed carry permits tied to that suspect, or an application for a permit to purchase a weapon? Do they see that?
Yes. Currently they do for concealed carry. And that's part of the law. The law is, and I don't want to offend anybody here right now, but the law is under attack as it currently stands. There's a move to have less or no training for those people who get concealed carry permits. There are certain things that want to be eliminated, like when you're stopped, you have to notify the law enforcement officer that you do have a permit and you do have a weapon on you. The training piece scares me, that if we just give people guns with no training, that could be a bad situation. You know, and I'm a gun enthusiast. I'm a cop. But to give people guns and go, here's your gun, you've got to understand when you get into a difficult situation, that's community property. And whoever is the strongest is going to own that community property. So if you're not trained with it or trained in how to use it, that could possibly be used against you. But currently they do, before they stop it, they'll run the license plate and it will come back to the owner of this vehicle has a concealed carry permit.
What about an application for a background check?
Those are not in the system right now. Yes, sir.
What is your answer to solving the mass shootings that this country's having? It sounds like a multifaceted approach that you have.
We always look at response, right? Everybody looks at reactivity. We've got to develop a way to look at people who are at risk or at high risk and develop a process for that so we can treat them and identify the issues prior to these things happening. One of the things you look at and you see in the interviews after the incident, they interview people and you always hear people go, I knew this was going to happen. And we just did an interview with Channel 10 on this very thing, on when should you notify people of people that you suspect could be a concern. And I would rather you be safe than sorry and have to apologize to the individual on the backside and go, you know what, I'm sorry, but here's what you displayed, than to go to the families of the victims and go, I'm really sorry, I knew this was going to happen. I should have reported it. You can never be too careful. So safe rather than sorry. But we're going to have to develop a process for looking at how do we identify some of these folks that have these issues, because these aren't things that happened overnight. You know, mental health is something that gradually builds untreated. Yes, sir.
Is there any, what I would call auditing from your department of the various police departments in our state? I just read an article today about a $50 million lawsuit awarded to a man in a Cleveland area jail who'd been locked up for 4 days without food and water, no toilet facilities. To get rid of the problems of police departments who are using force to contain people. I just wonder how much we're looking at police departments throughout the state, tying those into school systems, tying those into what the quality of their work, and getting people like you and your department out there in doing what I would call auditing. We're going to go into this police department, we're going to talk to the community people, and we're going to look at their records on their arrests and so forth, their facilities for containing prisoners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so we can improve the quality of dealing with human beings in a reasonable manner.
That's a very good question. Jails have their own auditing system within the state that falls under the Department of Public Safety. So they do regular audits. The training piece, the Attorney General operates the Ohio Peace Officers Training Academy, and that's where most training come out of, especially when we look at the different curriculum and things like that. So while there have been some issues in Ohio, we are one of the cleanest states when it comes to stuff like that you'll find in the country. Now, keep in mind also, as far as BCI goes, we have to be invited in. So we just can't go into a police department and go, we're going to audit this, this, and this. Unless it's the OLEG system I talked about, the reporting system and records management system, we audit those police departments consistently. Right now we've got 3 individuals indicted for misuse of OLEG. And we indict those individuals very quickly, and we bring them to court swiftly. And we've had convictions on everybody we've indicted on that. But we can always be more professional from a law enforcement standpoint. Yes, ma'am.
What's your view on the sale of the AK-47s and those kind of high-powered guns? And is there anything that can be done to either eliminate or help stop what's happening?
Again, I think we have to look at pre-event. You know, we just had a case in Southern California where an individual stabbed 4 people to death with knives. If we eliminate guns, whether you agree with it or not, that would never have prevented that event either. I don't necessarily believe if you eliminate one type of gun, you're going to stop all violence in society. It's way bigger than that. So again, we have to look at people who are at risk or potentially at risk and find a way to correct their behavior before it becomes an issue. Yes, sir.
Why was there a rape prosecution limit in the first place?
That, I had the honor of serving on the Ohio Revised Code updating committee 2 years ago. And that was instituted in 1972. So why it was put in for a statute of limitations, I think if you look back then, sadly, rape was not a big issue. It wasn't seen as the heinous crime that it is. And as we've progressed as a society, people have seen how that victimizes people, and it should be without a statute of limitations. It absolutely should be. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the human trafficking. So Ohio is 4th for a transport city. We're behind California, Texas, Florida. What is being done to diminish the trafficking, like the transport through Ohio? What is your organization doing to help with that? Because you mentioned you have a task force for that.
We work with the FBI, and the FBI are part of the task forces. One thing to realize, we have jurisdiction within the state of Ohio. When we team up with the FBI, we then have national and international jurisdiction. So when our agents are on the task force sponsored by the FBI, they're sworn in as task force officers, meaning they've got all the power of an FBI agent as far as jurisdiction. So we've got a number of task forces in Ohio, and we focus and concentrate on the hotspot areas. Toledo is an inland port, Cleveland's an inland port, and we get a lot of traffic through there. We took a very active step in Westerville when I was there on massage parlors. And when you look at those generally ladies that are working there, they're brought from China with the hope of getting a job here and a promise of getting a job here. They're immediately either addicted to drugs or they're taken into the sex slave trade. The threat that they experience is not one where they're locked in a basement. It's the threat of, we will report you to your family on what you're doing right now. And that is so strong of a threat that they'll do anything they're told to do. We have this stereotype that when we talk about sex slave trade, you think about people chained up in a basement or locked in a bedroom. A lot of these folks are free to come and go to an extent. But there's always the threat held over them of, they'll either report that to their families or send them back to China. And all of our sex slave trade that comes through for the United States comes through Flushing, New York. And that's the distribution point for the United States. Yes, sir.
What's your take on white supremacy? How prevalent is it in Ohio? And how does that propaganda influence these mass shootings that we're talking about?
Well, when you look, you've seen a lot of people, white supremacy, and how does that influence some of the mass shootings that have happened recently? As we've seen, a lot of the people that do this have manifestos that cite some of the, whether it's white supremacy or any other subversive group, they will cite that. Understand a lot of these people also have mental health issues. So it could be one little thing that they pick out of a speech or a statement, and that's going to be their flashpoint. And what we think of as not a subversive organization, they could twist and turn things to mean that way. I look at Charles Manson and some of the stuff that he did, and using the Bible as part of his manifesto, and some of the other folks that have used religious means that way. Again, we've got to look at these folks and try to identify them prior to them taking any actions. You know, for an individual to shoot his own sister is more than, I'm a white supremacist or I'm Antifa. That's way more than that. And how do we corral that? Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if you investigate the Muslims that are looking at Sharia law and putting that into the United States. I know I read somewhere where Hilliard is a hot spot for that, with their mosque and their school.
Well, the question was Sharia law and what do we do to talk about Sharia law? Also understand, and we were very close to the Muslim community when I was in Westerville. We met with the imams and elders quarterly. Understand, every religion has their radical side, their moderate side, and their very liberal side, right? That's every religion. I will tell you, the average person I dealt with from the Muslim community wanted the same things I want. They want a better life for their kids, and they want their kids to be successful and safe. Not once did I have a Muslim say, I want to kill you because you're not a Muslim. Now, are there radical elements out there? Absolutely. Again, I mentioned Charles Manson, David Koresh. I'm Catholic. They base their actions on the Bible, some of their actions on the Bible. So you have radical elements all over the place, but the jurisdiction would be the FBI for that, working with task forces. In the United States, we have task forces called Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and they work on foreign groups as well as domestic terrorism. Right now, we've experienced almost 10 to 20 times as many domestic terrorism actions as we have foreign terrorism actions in the United States. We're at 250 mass shootings right now, 254 now, this year. The great majority of those are domestic terrorism actions. Yes, sir.
Do you have any opinion on Jeffrey Epstein's death?
You know, death is tragic. Sorry, Mike. Death is tragic anytime it happens. Didn't mean to cut into your business. But, you know, it's amazing when it's going to be interesting to see the outcome of that. He's in a federal holding area. They just came out yesterday with how overworked the guards were and how many shifts they were working back to back. And it'll be interesting to see the report on the FBI is going to investigate that, no doubt. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a comment as a mental health professional about predicting violent behavior, and that is that, from my understanding, all the studies I've read, when you take psychiatrists and try to predict violence, nobody really can do it. And that's the problem we're faced with. We really don't have the indicators that will tell us ahead of time. And yes, I agree that mental health can be a part of the problem, but also as a mental health professional, I really feel it's important to say most of the time we've got angry men with guns that are causing the domestic terrorism problem. And yeah, I would agree that people are slightly off when they're doing that kind of behavior. But I look at the culture as the level of anger in the culture, the road rage and the kind of things we've got going on. And I think that's just, we've got a lot of problems other than the mass shooting.
Well, I agree with you, but we can send people into space. There's got to be a way we can identify the issues. You know, there's got to be a way. I will tell you, I sat on a board that looked at how do we prevent kids from getting into drugs. And we had some educators in the room. And 2 were kindergarten teachers. And they said, I can tell you which kids are going to be apt to be the ones that get addicted to drugs from kindergarten, just by behavior. There's got to be a way to develop a behavioral skills, social behavioral process to look at they have the tendency and propensity to do some of this stuff. And I'd rather be wrong at that stage of the game than on the back end stage of the game. Yes, sir. I think we have one more question.
You mentioned you're a gun owner. What's your feeling about the effectiveness of having a gun in your home or from your person for self-defense? Is it a good idea or not?
I will tell you, we train regularly with it. We train in use of force. We train in the laws of self-defense. If you're not willing to do that, I don't think you're a responsible gun owner. So if you don't train and you're not familiar with the laws and how you can use it, I think you're putting yourself in danger and you're a liability.
So I should get a dog instead.
Or a big cat that's ferocious, I don't know. Folks, I want to thank you. I'll stick around for a little bit if you have questions.
Well, thank you, Joe. Great information, and give us a lot more to think about here. Next week's program, Joe talked a lot about technology and the technology they use. If you're interested in technology, next week's program should also be a big interest. We have David Zeiden from Verizon, and he's going to be talking about the 5G, the next generation of technology for phones and things. So if you're interested in that, we're going to get that. So bring some guests. If you're not personally interested, bring some guests along, because I think there are a lot of people interested in where we're going with that technology. Remind you to please fill out the green cards on your table to help us improve our programming over the future. And with that, thank you for coming to Rotary.